Welcome back, friends. Tonight, we're going to step into a world of fire, mystery, and survival. A world where the people who shaped civilization often lived in the shadows of history. Imagine the clang of iron on anvil echoing through a medieval village. The glowing forge, paint in the night sky in orange light. Or picture vast underground cities hidden beneath the hills of Turkey, where thousands of people once lived in secret. These are the stories most history books leave out, and tonight we're going to bring them to life. But before we dive in, take a second to make yourself comfortable. Dim the lights, settle in, and maybe grab a drink. If you enjoy stories like these, the strange, the forgotten, the hidden parts of our past, then go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. Not because some algorithm told you to, but because you truly want more of these journeys into history's quiet corners. Every click of support helps keep this channel alive, and it lets me keep creating these stories for you. Now, let's set the stage. History often celebrates kings, knights, and conquerors. Their names fill the pages of chronicles, and their statues rise in city squares. But what about the ones who stood behind them? The men and women who built the tools, forged the weapons, and kept entire communities alive. Their stories are rarely told, yet without them, history itself would have collapsed. Take the medieval blacksmith. In movies, we see them as rugged heroes, hammering steel in slow motion with sparks flying like fireworks. But the reality was backbreaking, suffocating, and endless work. For the blacksmith, childhood ended almost as soon as it began. By the time most kids were learning games, a blacksmith's son was already learning how not to burn his hands. Day after day, they worked in smoke-filled huts, breathing in dust and fire until their lungs gave out. Our bodies wore down, their hands turned into scarred tools of flesh and bone. And yet, they kept going, 'cause without them, no sword would be sharp, no plow would cut the soil, and no door would swing on its hinges. But blacksmiths weren't the only ones who carried hidden burdens. Across time and continents, other mysteries unfolded. In the deserts of Egypt, alchemy was born as something far more sacred than the quest for gold. It was a philosophy of transformation, both physical and spiritual. And deep beneath the ground in Cappadocia, Turkey, entire civilizations vanished into sprawling underground cities. These weren't simple hideouts. They were vast labyrinths with homes, chapels, wells, and even schools carved into stone to protect communities from dangers above. Tonight, we're going to follow these threads from the glowing forges of medieval Europe to the hidden chambers beneath Anatolia, and uncover the strange, often forgotten truth about the people who built our world in silence. So, lean back, relax, and let's begin. When we think about life in the Middle Ages, our imagination often drifts to the image of gallant knights' shining armor and bustling marketplaces, filled with laughter and trade. But just behind those polished illusions stood the figure of the blacksmith, a person whose reality could not have been further from the romantic visions painted in legends or modern films. Because for him, the forge was not a place of triumph and glory, but an endless furnace of labor where every day blurred into the next in a haze of heat, noise, and aching muscles. From the moment a child was old enough to walk without stumbling, his fate was sealed if he was born into the lineage of smiths, for the family trade was not a choice but an inheritance. And so the little boy who might have dreamed of running through fields or playing with his friends instead found himself standing at the edge of the fire, staring into the orange glow of molten metal as his father's stern voice echoed in the background, teaching not with gentle words, but with the hammer's command. The blacksmith's workshop was no picturesque place of artistry. It was a cramped, smoky hut where walls darkened with soot and ceilings seemed always ready to collapse under the weight of smoke that had nowhere to escape. And in this place of constant labor, the apprentice's hands quickly lost the softness of childhood, replaced by blisters, burns, and a strength forged, not through games, but through endless repetition of work that felt more like punishment than learning. While other children spent their days chasing animals or laughing in the sunlight, the apprentice carried buckets heavier than himself, fumbled with tools that pinched and bit at his fingers, and stoked fires that burned with a heat so intense it seemed alive, a beast demanding to be fed with wood and coal without end. To outsiders, the sound of hammer striking iron may have seemed like music, a steady rhythm that echoed through the village like the heartbeat of progress. But to the young blacksmith, it was a relentless drum that measured every passing hour, every mistake corrected by harsher instruction, every small success overshadowed by the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same unending cycle of sweat and toil. There were no festivals in the forge, no moments of leisure where one could forget the work, because in this world, time off was a luxury reserved for others. And the blacksmith's family knew only that when one tool was completed, another was waiting. When one sword was sharpened, a plow needed fixing, and when the day's orders were done, preparation for the next began before dawn had even broken. And yet, within this world of hardship, there was a strange kind of transformation, a hidden alchemy that changed not only the iron on the anvil, but also the boy himself. For slowly his arms grew strong enough to lift the hammer with confidence. His senses sharpened to recognize the exact moment when the metal was ready to bend, and although exhaustion clung to him like a shadow, he discovered fleeting moments of pride when a blade gleamed in the firelight or a horseshoe fitted perfectly to its shape. These moments did not erase the hardship or the endless cycle of labor, but they offered a spark of meaning, a reminder that even in the smoke and sweat, creation was taking place, and the blacksmith, though invisible in the stories of kings and knights, was quietly shaping the very world those figures relied upon. For the sons of blacksmiths, the notion of childhood as a time of carefree exploration and endless play was little more than a distant dream, because from the moment they reached the fragile age of 6, most children would still be chasing one another in fields or learning simple songs at their mother's knee. They were instead summoned into the shadows of the forge, where the first lessons of their life would be taught, not in words written on parchment, but in the harsh language of fire, weight, and unrelenting labor. The boy would rise with the dawn, rubbing sleep from his eyes, only to be greeted by the smell of coal and smoke that seemed to seep into everything he owned. His toys replaced by iron tongs far too large for his hands. His playground, nothing but the dirt floor where embers sometimes fell and hissed as though the earth itself resented his intrusion. There was no gentle easing into responsibility. Rather, the child was immediately entrusted with tasks that carried real danger. For the forge recognized no age and no weakness, and if a bucket of water needed carrying, or the bellows demanded hours of pumping to keep the fire alive, fell to the apprentice to do it, regardless of his small frame or trembling arms. Mistakes were not tolerated, because a moment's carelessness could mean a ruined piece of work, a delay in fulfilling an order, or worse, an injury that might linger for life. And so, the child learned quickly that the forge was not a place for hesitation, that every movement of his hands had to be precise, that every step carried risk, and that obedience was not merely expected, but essential to survival. While other children learned to count by tracing numbers in the dust or practiced rhymes to amuse themselves during long afternoons, the young blacksmith's son learned to read the color of iron as it heated, memorizing the subtle shift from dark red to glowing orange that signaled it was ready to be struck. And he understood with frightening clarity that failure to notice such changes would not bring gentle correction, but sharp reprimands, or worse, the bitter sting of burns that left scars not only on his skin, but deep in his memory. There was no freedom in this apprenticeship, no choice to wander away or decide that the day's tasks were too much, because in this family trade, duty bound the child as surely as chains, and the only escape from the forge was the brief reprieve of sleep, which itself was haunted by the echoing clang of the hammer that seemed to follow him even into dreams. And yet, despite the hardships, Its relentless training forged something within the boy that went beyond calloused hands and weary limbs. It instilled a sense of endurance, of resilience, of belonging to a lineage where every scar was a mark of survival. Every long day, a testament to the unbroken chain that linked father to son, generation after generation. Though he might have envied the laughter of village children who ran freely through fields, he carried within himself a different kind of inheritance, one carved in fire and tempered in smoke. And, as the seasons passed, he began to understand that his life would never be measured by hours of play, but by the tools he shaped, the weapons he forged, and the quiet, unacknowledged strength that kept the world around him turning. As the boy grew older and his shoulders broadened under the weight of years spent inside the forge, he began to realize that the life of a blacksmith is not measured in hours or days in the way other villagers might count their time, because the work had no true beginning and no clear end. It was instead an unbroken cycle where the rising of the sun simply meant the resumption of labor, and the fading of daylight brought only the knowledge that the tasks would resume again tomorrow. The blacksmith's calendar was not filled with holy days, market fairs, or seasons of rest, for the forge cared nothing for festivals or feasts, and even when bells rang from the village church or music drifted faintly from a nearby gathering, the smith remained bent over his anvil, hammer in hand, because someone always needed a blade repaired, a plow reshaped, or a wagon wheel strengthened before it collapsed entirely. Each day was long, stretching out in endless repetition, beginning with the harsh crackle of fire as coal was coaxed into life, and ending only when exhaustion finally forced the hammer to fall silent. There were no weekends to anticipate, no holidays where the forge could sleep, because the demands of the village were ceaseless, and if the smith dared to pause, the consequences would soon arrive at his door in the form of impatient farmers, frustrated soldiers, or desperate townsfolk whose lives depended upon the tools of his trade. In this relentless world, free time existed only as an illusion, a fleeting pause between one order and the next, a moment stolen before another urgent knock rattled the door. The range of work was staggering, for the blacksmith was not a craftsman of one specialty, but the silent servant of an entire community's needs. In the morning, he might be shaping horseshoes to keep the animals of the Lord's stables fit for travel. By midday, he could be reforging a bent sword carried home from a skirmish at the border. And by nightfall, he would be asked to repair a farmer's plow whose broken edge threatened the season's harvest. Each task carried its own demands, and yet none could be delayed, for in an age where survival hung by threads of iron and wood, every hinge, every nail, every blade was essential, and the blacksmith was the unseen hand that kept the fragile balance intact. The labor itself was crushing, for every piece of iron required endless effort, heated and reheated until pliable, beaten again and again beneath the hammer's weight, then quenched, sharpened, and tested before it could be delivered. The muscles of the smith were never allowed to rest. His body, bent and hardened by decades of service to the fire, his skin darkened not by the sun, but by soot and smoke, but wrapped itself around him like a second garment. Even when his arms screamed with fatigue and his back ached with unrelenting pain, he pressed on, because the forge permitted no weakness in the community, as survival did not pause simply because the craftsman longed for relief. And yet, within this endless cycle of labor, there was a kind of quiet dignity, for although no holiday recognized his work and no festival celebrated his name, the smith knew that every hinge that held a door, every blade that defended a soldier, every nail that secured a roof was his silent contribution to the survival of all those around him. He would never sit at the high tables of nobility, nor would his deeds be sung by bards in candlelit halls, but he carried within himself the knowledge that the world as it was could not stand without the rhythm of his hammer, the patience of his fire, and the endurance of his unbroken will. The forge itself was not merely a workplace, but a world of its own, a living, breathing creature of fire and shadow that that consumed everything within it. And anyone who spent their life inside its embrace knew that the heat was not simply uncomfortable. It was overwhelming, pressing down on the body with a weight that made every movement feel heavier than it should, as though invisible hands were always pushing against the chest. The flames roared from the furnace with an intensity that seemed almost alive, licking at the walls and filling the cramped space with a constant glow, so that even when the sun had set outside, the interior remained lit in a flickering dance of orange and red that blurred the hours together and made time itself difficult to measure. The blacksmith lived in this glow day after day, his skin coated with a sheen of sweat that never truly dried, his tunic stained with soot that clung stubbornly no matter how many times he tried to wash it away, and the air he breathed was never clean, for every inhalation carried with it the sting of smoke, the sharp bite of burning coal, and the bitter taste of metal dust that seemed to settle on his tongue and throat as though it meant to stay forever. It was impossible to escape the smoke, for the forge offered no luxury of chimneys or proper ventilation, only narrow gaps where the air struggled to find a way out. And so the blacksmith inhaled the very substance of his own labor with each breath, his lungs slowly darkening as if the fire had taken root inside him. At first, the coughing was sporadic, a nuisance pushed aside by the demands of the hammer and anvil. But as the years wore on, the cough became a constant companion, a rhythm that matched the clanging of metal, until the act of breathing itself felt like another task forced upon a body already burdened with too many. His voice grew rough, deepened not by age alone, but by the harsh air he swallowed daily, and when he spoke, it carried the rasp of smoke and the echo of countless hours spent inhaling the forge's poison. The heat was no kinder, for the furnace did not simply warm the room, it devoured it, wrapping the blacksmith in an invisible cloak that never loosened, even in winter, so that while the villagers complained of frost and shivered under blankets, the smith stood in a haze of stifling warmth, sweat dripping from his brow onto the metal below. The walls of the forge, blackened with soot, seemed to radiate that heat back at him, amplifying it until his very bones felt scorched. And in such conditions, fatigue came quickly, though he dared not yield, because every delay meant another order late, another villager displeased, another reminder that his work was never his own, but always at the mercy of others' demands. The combination of smoke, dust, and relentless heat did not only shape his lungs and skin, it altered the very rhythm of his body, so that sleep became restless, interrupted by wheezing or by the phantom ringing of hammer on metal that refused to fade even when the forge lay quiet. His muscles twitched at night as though they still swung the hammer, his chest burned with each breath, and yet when dawn returned, he rose once more to step back into the inferno, because the forge demanded his presence, and he could not imagine a world without its fire. In time, this environment became so familiar that clean air itself felt alien, silence felt unsettling, and the coolness of an open field seemed almost wrong. For the blacksmith had been reshaped by the very elements that had threatened to destroy him. He became in a strange way not only the master of the forge, but also its prisoner bound to its smoke and heat until the end, carrying within his body the scars of fire, not only on his skin, but deep within his lungs and bones, a reminder that to shape the world and iron was also to let the fire reshape him. Living each day in the forge meant accepting that pain was not an occasional visitor, but a constant companion, because the very nature of the work demanded the handling of tools and fire that could turn against their master in an instant. And no matter how skilled or cautious the blacksmith became, accidents were inevitable, woven into the rhythm of his craft as surely as the ringing of hammer on anvil. The heat that softened iron did not distinguish between metal and flesh, and so burns were as common as blisters, small at first, like fleeting kisses of the flame when a spark leapt too far, but growing into deeper scars when a glowing shard of iron clung stubbornly to skin, or when a hand lingered a moment too long near the furnace. These burns never truly healed, for as soon as one began to fade, another would take its place, until the smith's arms and hands bore a patchwork of marks that told the silent story of battles fought not with enemies, but with the tools of his own survival. Cuts, too, were unavoidable, the sharp edges of unfinished blades and rough iron sheets slicing through skin as though to remind the craftsman that mastery came at a price. And so the blacksmith often worked with fingers wrapped in scraps of cloth stained by both sweat and blood. These makeshift bandages offered little comfort, but there was no time for rest or healing, 'cause the village would not wait for a smith to recover, and so he learned to continue hammering even with his palms torn open, his grip steady only through sheer determination. The sting of these wounds blended into the greater symphony of discomfort, and soon the difference between the pain of a cut and the ache of strained muscles blurred until the body accepted them as one. Perhaps the most feared injuries were those that came suddenly without warning, when a misjudged strike or a careless slip of the tongs allowed the full weight of the hammer or the unforgiving edge of the anvil to crush a finger, leaving it blackened, swollen, or even broken. Yet even such accidents were not treated as catastrophes in the forge. They were simply part of the trade, endured with gritted teeth and quiet curses before the work resumed. A crushed finger might throb for weeks. Nails might fall away to reveal raw flesh beneath, but the hammer could not be abandoned. And the blacksmith learned to wield his tools with whichever hand hurt less, adapting, compensating, pushing forward as though the forge itself mocked weakness and demanded proof of loyalty through suffering. Over time, the accumulation of these injuries transformed the smith's hands into something almost unrecognizable. No longer soft instruments of touch, but hardened, scarred tools in their own right. Their skin rough and thick as leather, their nails cracked or missing, their knuckles swollen and stiff from years of blows. Strangers might recoil at the sight of such hands, but within the village they were recognized as the mark of endurance, a badge of survival that set the smith apart from those whose labor left no visible trace. Each scar was a reminder that the craft was not simply about shaping iron, but about being shaped by it in return, the body becoming as much a creation of the forge as the swords and plows that left his fire. And though the blacksmith might never speak of pride in these marks, deep within he knew that they were proof of a life spent in service to the craft, a legacy etched not in ink or stone, but in the very flesh of his being. Despite the constant pain and exhaustion, the locksmith could never allow himself the luxury of retreat, because he understood better than anyone that his role was not merely a trade, but the backbone of the community itself. For without his hands to shape iron and repair what had been broken, the fragile rhythm of village life would quickly unravel. The knight who rode proudly through the streets with polished armor and a gleaming sword was celebrated as a figure of strength and honor. Yet those weapons owed their sharpness and resilience not to divine blessing or noble lineage, but to the hours the blacksmith had spent hammering, tempering, and sharpening them beneath the dim light of his smoky workshop. The farmer whose livelihood depended on cutting through stubborn soil could not sow or harvest without the plows, hoes, and sickles forged and mended in the fire, while the shepherd relied on hinges and latches crafted at the anvil to secure his pens against hungry predators. Even the baker, who filled the air with the scent of bread each morning, needed oven doors and spits repaired when age and fire wore them down. And the monk, who called the faithful to prayer, depended on bells that only the smith could recast when they cracked under strain. In truth, there was no corner of village life untouched by his work, and this made him both indispensable and perpetually in demand. Yet the recognition rarely matched the necessity, for while the blacksmith knew in his heart that every working wheel, every swinging gate, and every sharp blade owed its existence to him, the gratitude of his neighbors was often fleeting. expressed in hurried nods or half-hearted promises of payment that were forgotten by the next market day. The people brought their problems to his door as if it were their right, convinced that he would always be there to fix whatever had broken. And so the blacksmith learned to live with the paradox of being essential, yet overlooked as labor, taken for granted, even as the entire community depended upon it. Requests came at all hours. Sometimes in the dead of night, when a horse had thrown a shoe, or when a cart had splintered on the road to town. And though his body longed for rest, he could never turn them away, because in the eyes of his neighbors, he was less a man than a living tool, an extension of the forge itself that could be summoned whenever need arose. The compensation for such devotion was often meager, a few coins when luck was kind, or more often a loaf of bread, a handful of onions, or a promise that might never be fulfilled. And still he accepted, 'cause refusal meant not only losing favor, but allowing the delicate machinery of village life to falter. And so, day after day, the blacksmith endured the endless stream of demands, shaping metal with a patience that masked his weariness, knowing that though his name would never be carved into chronicles or sung by traveling bards, his presence was written into the fabric of every life around him. The villagers might forget to thank him, might walk away with their repaired tools as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the blacksmith carried within himself a quiet understanding that without his fire and his hands, the entire community would collapse into stillness, its doors unable to swing, its carts unable to roll, its fields left unplowed, and its knights left unarmed. In that truth lay his unspoken power, the knowledge that though unseen and uncelebrated, he was the iron thread binding the village together. Yet for all this unshakable dependence, the blacksmith lived a life that seemed strangely out of balance, because while his labor was sought after by everyone from the humblest farmer to the proudest knight, the reward he received was rarely enough to reflect the true weight of his contribution. It was a bitter irony of his existence that the very hands which kept swords sharp and plows ready for the fields were often left empty of fair coin. And though the village could not function without him, he was seldom honored, seldom celebrated, and almost never remembered in a way men of lesser toil but greater visibility were. When others dined on rich meals at the Lord's table or filled the air with laughter at the tavern, the blacksmith often sat in silence over a crust of bread and a cup of weak ale, his body aching from the day. Labor in his mind, turning over the unfair truth that survival depended on him, yet respect seemed always out of reach. Villagers would walk into his workshop with the easy confidence of those who believed service was owed to them, placing a broken plow or dented blade upon his bench, as if the forge were not a place of sweat and sacrifice, but a magical corner where objects were simply mended by will alone. Promises of payment were plentiful, yet silver coins were scarce, and many believed that a sack of grain, a basket of eggs, or a loaf of bread ought to suffice for work that demanded not only strength but years of mastery. The smith could protest, but to refuse outright was unthinkable, for the village needed him, and if he ever turned someone away, resentment would ripple quickly through the community, casting him as the one who withheld rather than the one who endlessly gave. And so he accepted what he was offered, not because it was just, but because it was the only way to keep peace with those who depended on him most. The thankfulness he did receive was fleeting, often no more than a nod or a muttered word, as a tool was lifted from his bench and carried away, leaving him once again in the smoky silence of the forge. There were no songs written for the man who repaired the hinges that held the door in place, no blessings for the one who shaped the sides that reaped the harvest, no prayers whispered for the weary hands that allowed the soldier's blade to remain sharp in battle. Instead, the blacksmith's name faded into the background, remembered only when something broke and quickly forgotten once the problem was fixed. He was visible only in times of need and invisible once his task was done, a ghost tethered to fire and iron, always working yet never truly acknowledged. This invisibility weighed heavily upon him. For while pride could be found in the steady rhythm of the hammer and in the knowledge that his craft sustained life, the absence of gratitude hollowed those moments, reminding him again and again that society valued the product of his labor far more than the man who created it. And though he endured, though he rose each morning to face the fire once again, deep within his heart there lingered the quiet ache of knowing that his sacrifices, his scars, and his endless years of service would pass largely unnoticed, buried beneath the noise of history that chose to sing of kings and warriors rather than the silent figure who had armed them all. There were moments, however, when the steady hum of village life was shattered by the distant thunder of conflict. And though war brought suffering to many, for the blacksmith it carried with it a cruel paradox. Because the very chaos that tore families apart and filled the land with fear also breathed relentless life into his forge. When rumors spread that borders were threatened, or when the lord of the manor raised his banner and called the men to arms, the blacksmith's quiet, overlooked existence was suddenly thrust into the heart of urgency. For every soldier required a blade, every knight needed armor, every garrison demanded arrowheads and spear tips, and it was upon his shoulders that these demands fell. The once meager trickle of requests became a flood, carts laden with raw iron arriving at his door, orders shouted with desperation, and the forge roaring day and night without pause as he raced to meet the needs of war. The rhythm of the hammer quickened, each strike echoing like a drumbeat of battle long before swords clashed. On the field and in those weeks the blacksmith knew no rest, his arms swinging until they ached as though weighted with stone, his face dripping with sweat that mingled with the soot already embedded in his skin. He worked not only for coin, but under the pressure of urgency. For a delay in one piece could mean disaster for those who carried it. And so he pushed himself past exhaustion, sleeping only in brief, stolen moments, the roar of the forge haunting even his dreams. The villagers, who once offered only bread or promises, now appeared with coin in hand, for in times of war no one questioned the value of his craft. And though his work was finally paid in silver, the cost was extracted in sleepless nights and the relentless pounding of his body against the demands of iron and fire. The air in his workshop became thick with sparks and noise as apprentices were pressed into service. Boys who once stoked fires now hammering desperately under his guidance, their small arms trembling but their faces hardened by the urgency of the moment. Armor was beaten into shape at reckless speed, swords quenched and sharpened in endless succession. Arrowheads churned out in great piles like black rain awaiting the storm. Outside, soldiers drilled with wooden spears, while inside the forge the real weapons of war were born. And though the blacksmith would never stand upon the battlefield, knew that his labor would be carried there, wielded by men whose lives depended upon its strength. Yet, even as the forge filled his purse more than any harvest season ever had, the blacksmith could not ignore the weight pressing upon his conscience. For he understood with grim clarity that the same blades he created to defend his village could also bring ruin to another. That each strike of his hammer not only armed his neighbors, but condemned strangers to suffering. And still he continued, because refusal was impossible, because survival of his own family and community depended on his obedience to the call of war. In those times, he was indispensable, no longer invisible, but instead besieged by attention. He knew it was not him they valued, but the weapons he produced. And when the battles ended, when the banners fell silent, the silver would vanish. The urgency would fade, and he would return once more to being the forgotten craftsman, laboring in shadows as though he had never been the silent engine that armed an army. When the drums of war finally faded, and the banners that had once whipped violently in the wind were lowered, the blacksmith might have hoped for rest, for a quieter life, free from the endless pressure of forging weapons that carried with them the weight of life and death. Yet the end of conflict rarely brought comfort to his household. It's because peace, though cherished by lords and peasants alike, was a season of uncertainty for the man whose livelihood had been fueled by the desperate demands of armies. The steady flow of coin that once poured into his forge like molten metal slowed to a trickle, and suddenly the hammer that had rung day and night in a frenzy of production began to fall less often, its sound no longer echoing with the urgency of survival, but with the heavy silence of dwindling need. Villagers, no longer pressed by the immediate threat of battle, turned to their old habits, once again treating the blacksmith's work as something ordinary, something that could be compensated with a basket of onions, a stale loaf of bread, or a promise to pay when the next harvest was kind enough to provide surplus. The man who had been praised and sought after when spears were needed in haste now found himself bargaining for scraps. His skill diminished in their eyes, as though the iron he shaped had lost its value the moment the swords no longer drew blood. It was a cruel reversal of fortune, for only days earlier he had been indispensable, courted by nobles and captains, his forge blazing like the heart of the village, but now he was once again the invisible laborer, struggling to keep food on the table for his family. In these long stretches of peace, the blacksmith's days were filled not with the clang of steel meant for war, but with the quieter, less profitable tasks of repairing tools that farmers had neglected or mending hinges that villagers were in no rush to fix. And though the work continued, it paid in morsels rather than coin, leaving him forever calculating how to stretch what little he had, how to barter his strength for enough sustenance to survive another week. His wife might return from the market with only a handful of vegetables purchased, not with silver, but with the unspoken stat of his labor, while his children ate in silence, too young to understand why their father, who had once seemed so vital during the dark days of battle, now carried the heavy expression of a man slowly being forgotten by the very people he had served. What weighed most heavily on him was not the hunger itself, but the knowledge that his fate was bound to the whims of forces beyond his control. That he would always be trapped between the abundance of war and the famine of peace, never secure, never free, always dependent on the unpredictable tides of history. And so he continued, quietly enduring, his forge lit, not with the roar of endless orders, but with the steady, almost mournful glow of survival. A reminder that while peace might bring joy to the village, it carried a far more complicated burden for the man whose hands had built both the tools of war and the instruments of daily life, yet was rarely rewarded in proportion to the sacrifices he made. The return of peace, though it silenced the clang of swords and spears, did nothing to silence the ceaseless demands of survival, and so the blacksmith's life continued to unfold in a rhythm that left little space for comfort, because even when the forge was not overflowing with orders, the struggle to provide for his family pressed upon him with equal weight, and rest was a luxury he could rarely afford. Each morning arrived too quickly, pulling him from a bed that was more straw than mattress, where the thin blanket did little to guard against the chill that crept through the cracks of his home. He rose with a body still heavy from yesterday's toil, his bones stiff, his muscles aching, and his mind clouded with a residue of dreams that never brought refreshment, for even in sleep the rhythm of hammer and anvil echoed in his ears like an unending song. Food, the fuel that might have eased his burden, was seldom plentiful and almost never rich, for the payment he received in onions. Coarse bread or a few wilted vegetables left little room for variety, and so his meals were repetitive and meager. The blacksmith ate not to enjoy, but to endure, each bite swallowed with the knowledge that it was barely enough to sustain the strength required to lift the hammer once more. On days when work was scarce, he often allowed his children to eat more while he took less, his hunger concealed behind a stoic silence, though his body betrayed him with weakness and fatigue that grew heavier as the weeks stretched on. The rare moments when coin entered his household, perhaps after repairing a weapon for a noble or a particularly generous farmer, were celebrated like festivals. Yet even then, the feast was modest, quickly consumed, and followed by a return to scarcity. Sleep, too, failed to bring the relief it promised for while the villagers rested soundly after their own labors. The blacksmith often lay awake, his chest tight from the smoke he had inhaled throughout the day, his breath shallow and uneven, his thoughts circling endlessly around debts, repairs, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. When slumber did come, it was rarely peaceful, interrupted by coughing fits or by the phantom weight of the hammer that seemed to hover over his dreams, striking again and again against the anvil of his mind. He awoke, not refreshed, but drained, his body stiff and sore, his eyelids heavy. Yet he dragged himself to the forge because duty left him no alternative. This cycle of inadequate nourishment, restless sleep, and relentless labor carved exhaustion into every part of him, etching deep lines into his face, bending his back before its time, and reducing his steps to a slow, heavy rhythm that spoke of years carrying more than any man should. And though he sometimes paused to lean on his hammer, staring into the flames with hollow eyes, he never allowed himself to surrender fully, because he knew that his family depended on his endurance, and that the village, however ungrateful, would not stand without the silent rhythm of his labor. It was a life without rest, a life where every day blurred into the next, bound together by fatigue. And yet it was a life he continued to live, because the forge, cruel as it was, had become inseparable from his very being. Over the years, the consequences of such a relentless life became etched into the very shape of the blacksmith's body, so that anyone who looked closely could read the story of his suffering, not in words, but in posture, in the way his shoulders curved forward as if he were forever leaning toward the fire, in the slow heaviness of his steps that betrayed a lifetime of standing too long upon weary legs. His back, once straight in the days of youthful apprenticeship, gradually bent beneath the invisible weight of endless labor, and though he tried to carry himself with the quiet dignity of his craft, the curvature of his spine revealed what the forge had demanded from him, a price paid not in coin but in the distortion of his very frame. His hands, more than any other part of him, bore the clearest testimony of his profession, for they were no longer the supple instruments of human touch, but gnarled tools shaped by decades of striking, gripping, and enduring. The skin had thickened into calluses, so coarse that they resembled leather more than flesh, the nails cracked and broken, the knuckles swollen to twice their natural size, each joint stiff with the ache of arthritis brought on long before old age should have set in. These hands were strong, yes, but they were also ruined, incapable of gentleness, incapable of delicate movement, their scars forming a map of every accident, every burn, every cut that had once bled but never truly healed. Children who glimpsed them sometimes shrank away, but to the blacksmith they were the inevitable result of devotion, the only inheritance he could pass down with certainty. The air he had breathed for decades left its scars hidden within him, less visible than the burns or the bent back, yet no less destructive. Years of inhaling smoke, thick with coal dust and metal shavings, had blackened his lungs, leaving him with a cough that rattled through his chest like a bellows wheezing its last breath. Breathing became labor in itself, each inhale shallow, each exhale accompanied by a heaviness that no amount of rest could ease. Conversations often left him winded, laughter turned quickly into wheezing, and cold nights made his chest tighten as though iron bands had been fastened around his ribs. The forge had filled his lungs with its poison, and though his spirit remained unbroken, his body betrayed him, forcing him to slow, even when his mind urged him forward. Life expectancy for men like him was cruelly short, and he knew it, though he seldom spoke of it aloud. Few blacksmiths lived to see their hair turn fully white, and many were laid to rest while their children were still learning the craft, their bodies simply unable to withstand the decades of strain demanded by fire and iron. The village might mourn briefly when such a man passed, but soon his absence was forgotten, replaced by the next smith who stepped forward to take his place at the anvil. For the blacksmith himself, This knowledge was a constant shadow, the certainty that his life would likely end earlier than it should. Not through sudden violence on a battlefield, but through the slow, grinding erosion of strength caused by years of heat, smoke, and strain. And yet, despite the ruined hands, the bent back, the rasping lungs, and the knowledge that his time might be short, a blacksmith endured, for the forge demanded it, his family required it, and his own pride in the craft would not allow him to walk away. His body was broken long before his spirit was, and in that, perhaps, lay the truest measure of his sacrifice. The forge did not belong to one man alone, for in truth it was an inheritance heavier than any chest of gold, passed from his father to son, like an unbroken chain that bound each generation to the same fire, the same smoke, the same unyielding hammer, from the moment a child was born into a blacksmith's household. His destiny was written in the glow of the furnace, his future sealed not by choice but by tradition, for this was not a profession that one entered willingly, but a burden that descended upon the shoulders of the next in line, whether he longed for it or not. The tools of the trade, the anvil scarred with decades of blows, the tongs blackened with soot, the hammer worn smooth by countless hands, were not possessions, but legacies waiting in silence for the boy who would eventually be old enough to wield them. A father, though exhausted from his own endless labors, came the stern teacher of his son, guiding him with the harshness that the forge demanded. For there was no time for gentleness in a place where a moment's hesitation could bring injury or ruin. Lessons were taught not with books or letters, but with repetition, with the weight of iron pressed into small hands, with the long hours spent observing every movement until imitation became instinct. The son who cried from the heat or faltered under the weight of the hammer was met not with pity, but with expectation, reminded that the survival of the family and the respect of the village rested upon his ability to endure just as his father had endured before him. In this way, childhood was compressed into apprenticeship, and apprenticeship into manhood, the transition happening almost without notice as the boy's frame hardened and his arms grew strong. Mothers, too, played their part, though their labor was quieter and less visible, for they tended the household that depended on the forge's meager earnings, patched the burns and cuts that apprentices carried home each night, and bore the sorrow of watching their children step into the same life of hardship they had seen consume their husbands. They might have wished for another path, perhaps a future in the church or a chance to serve in the Lord's hall, but opportunity rarely knocked at the door of a blacksmith's family, and so they steeled themselves with the knowledge that their sons would one day inherit both the pride and the suffering that came with the trade. This cycle of inheritance stretched backward as far as memory reached, each generation repeating the same pattern, as though the forge itself was an eternal flame passed from hand to hand, consuming those who fed it but never extinguishing. Some sons dreamed of escape, of leaving the village for a freer life, but duty and necessity held them fast, reminding them that their families would falter without their labor and that the village itself relied on their skill. And so the cycle endured, binding father and son not only through blood but through fire and iron, a bond that was as much a prison as it was a legacy, showing that the hardships of the past lived on in the present and would continue into the future. Although the forge demanded everything from those who served it, health, comfort, freedom, even years stolen from the span of their lives, there remained within the heart of many blacksmiths a quiet flame that was not of coal or firewood, but of pride. For even amidst exhaustion and pain, there were moments when creation revealed itself as something close to beauty, and in those rare instants the suffering seemed to recede into the background, replaced by the satisfaction of knowing that their labor had produced something both enduring and necessary. To outsiders, a plow might appear nothing more than a crude tool of iron, yet to the blacksmith who had coaxed its shape from raw ore, who had struck it again and again until the lines were true and the edge keen, it was a piece of his own spirit made solid, proof that his strength and skill had turned stubborn metal into something that could feed a village. The pride was never loud or boastful, for blacksmiths were not men given to grand speeches or displays. But it was felt deeply in the stillness after the hammer fell silent, in the way they ran their scarred hands over a finished blade and felt its balance, in the gleam of polished steel that reflected the firelight like a captured star. These were not moments of wealth or fame, but they were victories nonetheless, small triumphs that belonged only to the smith and the anvil, unrecognized by the world, yet profound to the man who had earned them. For a blacksmith, perfection was fleeting and rare, but when it came, it carried with it a sense of mastery that no coin could purchase, a reminder that beneath the soot and hardship lay a craftsman whose work had power to endure long after his own body had failed. Sometimes, as he watched a farmer walk away with a newly repaired plow or a knight fastened on armor that fit as though it were a second skin, the blacksmith felt a flicker of something like pride swell in his chest, though he said nothing of it. He understood that those who used his creations would rarely think of the man who had shaped them, but he also knew in a quiet way that his mark traveled farther than his name ever would, carried into fields, into battles, into distant places he himself would never see. The sword that defended a soldier's life, the nail that held together a roof during a storm, the hinge that swung open the village gates, all bore his unseen imprint, and though the world would forget him, the strength of his labor would remain. It was in these moments of recognition, these flashes of dignity, hidden within endless toil, that the blacksmith found the will to continue, for without them, the burdens of the forge would have been unbearable. The fire consumed his body day after day, but the act of creation fed his spirit, reminding him that though he was often unseen and undervalued, his work was far from meaningless. In the perfection of a well-forged piece, he glimpsed not only his own worth, but also the strange truth that, within the harshest suffering, there could still exist a spark of pride, glowing quietly like the ember of a forge that refused to die. What made the blacksmith's existence all the more extraordinary was the quiet truth that, though he lived in the margins of recognition, his labor was in fact the very foundation upon which the village, the manor, and even the kingdom itself rested. For without his forge, the fragile order of medieval life would have crumbled with startling speed. Every element of society, from the soldier marching to war, to the farmer tilling his soil, to the housewife cooking the evening meal, relied, often unknowingly, on the unseen strength of the blacksmith's work. His creations were everywhere, woven into the daily rhythm of life, like threads in a tapestry, invisible unless they snapped, and yet essential to holding the entire fabric together. The farmer who walked behind his plow, guiding it across the stubborn earth, might have thought of the season, the rain, the sun, and the soil. But rarely did he pause to consider the man who had forged the iron edge that cut into the ground, without which his seed would never take root. The soldier, standing proud in polished armor, ready to defend his lord's banner, might have felt courage in his heart and strength in his arm, but neither would have protected him without the breastplate that turned away a blade, or the sword balanced perfectly in his hand, each piece born in the sweat and fire of a forge far removed from the battlefield. Even the simplest acts of daily life, the mother drawing water from a well with an iron bucket, the child running through a door secured by metal, Kanjas, the priest ringing a bell to call the faithful to prayer, were possible only because the blacksmith's hands had shaped the iron that made those actions possible. It was a strange kind of power, one that did not bring fame or glory, yet reached into every corner of society with quiet persistence. The blacksmith did not sit in the halls of kings, nor did he ride at the front of armies, but his presence was felt in the strength of the tools, weapons, and structures that others relied upon. He was the skeleton beneath the flesh of society, the framework that kept it upright, the silent guarantor that life could proceed as it did. When his hammer fell silent, doors would no longer open, fields would no longer yield harvests, and armies would falter before they even reached the battlefield. And yet this central role was almost never acknowledged, for the blacksmith's labor was taken as a given, as natural as the rising of the sun or the falling of the rain. People assumed he would always be there, his forge always burning, his hands always ready to repair what had broken or to shape what was needed. This invisibility was both his burden and his strange form of immortality, for while his name might be forgotten, his work lived on in every structure, every blade, every tool that carried his imprint, into the world beyond the confines of his smoky workshop. In this way, though uncelebrated and often unappreciated, the blacksmith stood as the hidden backbone of medieval society. A man whose fire and iron sustained farms, armies, and homes alike, and whose quiet strength was the unspoken foundation upon which all else was built. Just as the steady rhythm of the hammer and the glow of the forge defined the blacksmith's world, shaping not only metal, but also the lives of those who depended upon it. There existed in the ancient imagination another vision of fire, transformation, and hidden power, a vision that reached far beyond the village workshop and carried humanity into the realms of mystery, philosophy, and the search for eternal truths. This was the domain of alchemy, a pursuit that, unlike blacksmithing, was not confined to practical needs alone, but sought to uncover the very secrets of creation itself, and its roots stretched back thousands of years to the sands and temples of Egypt, where the earliest whispers of this strange discipline first took form, in the great river valley of the Nile, where the annual flood brought both life and destruction, saw in the cycles of nature a profound mystery, one that spoke of death and rebirth, decay and renewal, and it was here that the idea of transformation began to weave itself into human thought. Temples dedicated to the gods housed not only rituals of worship, but also hidden studies in which priests, scribes, and thinkers experimented with substances, metals, and dyes, convinced that within these materials lay divine principles waiting to be revealed. To the Egyptians, alchemy was not simply the manipulation of matter, but a sacred science, tied to the eternal balance of the cosmos, reflection of the way the heavens mirrored the earth and the earth mirrored the heavens. Legends tell of secret texts inscribed upon emerald tablets containing truths whispered by the gods themselves, teachings that spoke of unity between the physical and the spiritual, and of the possibility that through knowledge one might bridge the gulf between mortal frailty and divine perfection. The maxim "as above, so below," which later echoed throughout alchemical traditions, had its earliest heartbeat here. In this land where pyramids rose like stairways to eternity, and where every grain of sand was thought to conceal hidden wisdom. Fire, which for the blacksmith was merely the tool of his trade, became for the Egyptian alchemist a symbol of purification, a force not only to shape metal, but to refine the soul. Alchemy in Egypt was not an isolated curiosity, but part of a broader worldview, one in which the natural world was infused with spirit and meaning, where every change of state, the turning of or into metal, the blending of colors into new hues, the fermentation of grapes into wine, was seen as a reflection of a higher order, a pattern set by divine hands. To pursue these mysteries was to engage with creation itself, to seek not only practical results, but also enlightenment, and it was this union of material experiment and spiritual quest that gave alchemy its enduring power. Thus, from the blackened forges of medieval Europe to the golden sands of ancient Egypt, the story of fire and transformation continued, shifting from the hands of laborers who shaped iron for survival to the minds of seekers who shaped symbols and ideas in their quest for ultimate truth. Where the blacksmith endured the harsh demands of necessity, the alchemist dreamed of transcending them, hoping that within the hidden laws of nature lay the key to unlocking not only the secrets of matter, but the mysteries of the human spirit itself. For the people of ancient Egypt, the practice that would later be called alchemy was never regarded as a mere curiosity of metals or a secret game of powders and fire, but rather as a sacred art, a divine science that reflected the eternal harmony between the world of the gods and the fragile lives of men. To the Egyptian mind, every element of nature was infused with spirit and purpose. The rising and falling of the Nile was not just a seasonal flood, but a living rhythm of life and death, the slow transformation of clay into brick or of copper into bronze was not merely mechanical, but a reenactment of the universal law that all things were born, changed, and renewed. In this vision, the manipulation of substances was a form of participation in the great cosmic order, a chance to mirror on earth the endless cycles written in the heavens. Temples were the centers of this sacred pursuit, their shadowed halls filled not only with incense and prayer, but also with quiet experiments carried out by priests who believed that every change in matter revealed some hidden truth about the soul. To heat a mineral until it glowed, to grind stones into powders of vivid color, to mix strange concoctions in vessels of clay. These were not seen as mundane tasks, but as holy acts, symbolic reenactments of creation itself, for the Egyptians believed that the same divine force that turned night into day and death to rebirth could also be glimpsed in the transformations of the laboratory. Thus, alchemy was never separated from religion, and those who practiced it did so not in search of mere wealth or trickery, but as seekers of sacred wisdom, hoping to draw nearer to the mysteries of the divine. The very landscape of Egypt reinforced this vision. The desert sands held veins of copper, gold, and other metals that shimmered like the flesh of the gods. The great river nurtured the harvests and supplied the clay, salt, and minerals the alchemists learned to combine. The sun itself, worshipped as Ra, became the eternal symbol of purification. Its scorching light burning away impurity, its daily rebirth across the horizon, reminding all that nothing was final, that everything could be transformed. To work with fire in the name of alchemy was to imitate the sun's eternal work, to purify, to transmute, and perhaps even to transcend the limits of mortality. For the Egyptians, the soul was as much in need of refinement as gold itself, and the sacred art of transformation promised not only material change, but spiritual elevation. They believed that just as lead could be coaxed toward perfection, so too could the human spirit be polished through discipline, wisdom, and devotion until it reflected the eternal radiance of the divine. In this way, the furnace was not only a tool, but an altar. The vessel not merely a container, but a chalice of mysteries. The process of change, not just an experiment, but a prayer. Thus, alchemy in Egypt stood at the meeting point of religion, culture, and spirituality. Bridge that allowed mortals to glimpse the eternal order through the fragile language of fire and matter. Where the blacksmith labored to serve his village, the alchemist labored to serve the cosmos, yet both, in their own way, bowed before the same mystery of transformation. Each strike of hammer or spark of flame whispering of the unseen forces that shaped not only iron or gold, but the very destiny of mankind. Among the most enduring legacies of Egyptian thought was the mysterious text that later generations would revere as the Emerald Tablet, a work wrapped in legend, attributed by some to the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, that strange and timeless figure who stood at the crossroads of divinity and humanity. The tablet, said to have been inscribed upon a single shining stone of deep green, was not a long treatise filled with elaborate instructions, but rather a series of brief and enigmatic lines, so concise that they seemed at first glance simple, yet so layered with meaning that scholars, mystics, scarings, and seekers of every century afterward would devote lifetimes to unraveling them. Its words spoke of unity, of correspondence between realms, of transformation, both of matter and of spirit. And at the heart of this teaching was the phrase that echoed like a cosmic law through all of Western esotericism: as above, so below. This principle was more than a poetic turn of phrase. It was a conviction that the universe was bound together by a secret symmetry, that the movements of the heavens were reflected in the smallest happenings of earth, and that the inner life of the soul mirrored the outward transformations of matter. For the alchemist, to heat, to melt, to transmute was not simply to alter a substance, but to participate in the eternal pattern that governed stars and gods alike. If the heavens could be read in the fire's glow, if the order of creation could be glimpsed in the changing color of metal, then the work of the alchemist was no mere craft, but a spiritual pilgrimage, a way of walking in step with the divine. The emerald tablet suggested that the path to perfection was the same for all things, whether for gold hidden in the veins of stone, or for the soul hidden in the body of man. Just as base metals might, through purification and discipline, approach the incorruptible brilliance of gold, so too might the flawed and wounded human spirit, through wisdom and transformation, draw closer to the light of the divine. This vision blurred the boundary between the physical and the spiritual, weaving them into a single tapestry where every act of change carried both material and mystical significance. For the seekers who studied the tablet, every symbol became a key, every phrase an invitation to contemplate the mysteries of existence. Fire was no longer only a source of heat, but the eternal purifier. Water was not simply a liquid, but the flow of life and death. The sun was not only a star, but the embodiment of divine order. To master alchemy was not simply to learn the techniques of the furnace and the vessel, but to understand the harmony that bound together heaven and earth, flesh and spirit, mortality and eternity. Thus, the emerald tablet became more than a fragment of text. It became a doorway, one that promised not only the secret of transmuting lead into gold, but the far greater possibility of transforming the human soul into something enduring and luminous. And in this teaching, the echo of Egypt's sacred science lived on, carrying forward the conviction that every change of matter was a reflection of a deeper truth, and that in the hidden correspondences of the cosmos lay the path to transcendence itself. From the ancient sands of Egypt, the tradition of transformation did not fade, but instead carried forward into Persia, where it encountered a civilization steeped in its own profound spiritual vision, one that revered fire not merely as a tool of survival or a symbol of purity, but as the very embodiment of divine presence. Within the teachings of Zoroastrianism, the sacred flame was the eternal witness to truth, a living connection between the mortal and the eternal, manifestation of the order that governed both heaven and earth. To gaze into fire was to see not only a source of light, but the reflection of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god. And so the Persian alchemist began his work with reverence, for every experiment with flame was also an act of devotion. In this land of empires and ancient wisdom, alchemy took on a distinctly spiritual hue. Yet, it did not abandon the practical world. Persian thinkers were philosophers and observers, but they were also experimenters who sought to understand the substances around them, recording their findings with precision while interpreting the results through the lens of cosmic order. Two separate metals to test the effects of heat, to refine minerals into medicines. These were not viewed as isolated acts of curiosity, but as reflections of a deeper principle, that matter itself carried within it a divine spark waiting to be revealed through careful work. The furnace and the vessel were treated almost like temples, their contents guarded with ritual care, as if the success of an experiment depended as much on purity of spirit as on skill of hand. Fire, above all, stood at the center of their vision. It was fire that consumed the impure, fire that revealed the essence of matter, fire that mirrored the eternal struggle between light and darkness, truth and falsehood, which lay at the heart of Zoroastrian cosmology. To harness it was to engage in the most sacred of acts, dangerous and transformative communion that carried both promise and peril. The Persian alchemist did not strike blindly at his materials, but approached them as one approaches a living mystery, cautious and respectful, seeking to draw out the hidden perfection that lay beneath the surface. This blending of spiritual devotion and practical investigation gave Persian alchemy a unique voice in the wider history of the discipline, Unlike the blacksmith, who labored only for the needs of his community, or the Egyptian priest who sought transformation as an echo of divine cycles, the Persian alchemist united both paths, seeing no contradiction between sacred ritual and precise experimentation. Each record of their work carried two layers: a description of the physical process and an interpretation of its spiritual significance, as though they believed that no change in matter was complete without a corresponding change in the soul. It was from this fusion of fire, faith, and practice that Persian alchemy left its mark upon the world, preserving the idea that the search for knowledge was inseparable from the search for truth, and that every transformation, whether of metal or of man, was a reflection of the eternal flame that bound the universe together. As the wisdom of Egypt mingled with the fire-centered spirituality of Persia, a new voice emerged from the crossroads of cultures, a thinker who would shape Kami into something more than the manipulation of matter, someone who recognized that the true furnace was not only in the workshop, but also within the human heart. This was Zosimos of Panopolis, a Greek-Egyptian philosopher who lived during the 3rd and 4th centuries of our era, a man whose writings became some of the earliest surviving texts on alchemy, and whose vision lifted the discipline from mere experiment into a profound spiritual path. For Zosimos, the transformations he observed in metals and substances were never merely physical phenomena. They were mirrors of the inner struggle of the soul, reflections of a process in which human beings themselves might be refined, purified, and reborn. In his works, Zosimos described furnaces and vessels, recipes and procedures, but always beneath the surface of his technical detail ran a deeper current of symbolism. To heat a metal until it glowed was in his eyes, akin to subjecting the soul to trials that burned away its corruption. To dissolve a substance was to strip away the illusions of the self. To purify gold was to glimpse the radiant perfection toward which all human beings were called. He spoke of alchemy as a sacred art that joined the body and the spirit, insisting that the true goal was not the mere creation of physical gold, but the transformation of the alchemist himself into a being of wisdom and clarity. His writings were filled with visions and allegories, strange and haunting images of figures, torn apart, dissolved, and reborn within vessels of glass, images that to some appeared frightening, but to Zosimos represented the necessary death of ignorance before the birth of enlightenment. He told of a priest who was cut into pieces and burned, only to rise again, purified. He described metals that wept, bled, and spoke, embodying the alchemist's own journey toward wholeness. These were not idle fantasies, but profound metaphors, teaching that one must submit to suffering, to dissolution, to the fire of truth, if one hoped to emerge as something greater than before. For Zosimos, the laboratory and the temple were indistinguishable, and the work of the alchemist was nothing less than a ritual of salvation. The furnaces, vessels, and strange symbols of his art were not tools for greed, but sacred instruments of transformation, guiding the practitioner toward the purification of body and soul. He warned against those who sought alchemy merely for wealth, for such men, he argued, would never understand its mysteries, just as one who stared at a flame for light alone would never feel its purifying heat. True alchemy, he insisted, was a spiritual discipline, demanding devotion, patience, and humility. For only through inner change could the outer mysteries be revealed. Thus, through the voice of Zosimos, alchemy became more than the hidden science of metals. It became a philosophy of the soul, path of purification that taught that just as base matter could be refined into gold, so too could the flawed human spirit be raised toward perfection. And, in this vision, alchemy moved beyond its practical roots, becoming a bridge between the material and the divine. A journey not only of the hands, but of the heart. From the mystical allegories of Zosimos, the current of alchemical thought flowed onward into a new era, where the torch of knowledge was taken up by scholars of the Islamic Golden Age, a period when the libraries of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba became vast reservoirs of wisdom, and the thirst for discovery stretched across the known world. Here, alchemy underwent a profound transformation, moving beyond the veiled language of vision and metaphor to become a disciplined study that sought to test, record, and refine. At the heart of this revolution stood Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latin as Gibber, a figure revered not only as an alchemist, but as the father of early chemistry, a man whose writings and experiments would echo through centuries, shaping both science and philosophy alike. Jabir inherited the symbolic traditions of Egypt, Persia, and Greece, but he refused to leave them cloaked in mystery alone. Instead, he insisted that true knowledge required method, that experimentation must be repeated, that results had to be observed with care and written down with precision. He developed a language of ratios and measurements, laying the groundwork for processes that would one day form the very foundations of scientific inquiry. Where earlier alchemists spoke of spiritual transformations through allegory, Jabir also spoke of balances, compounds, and procedures, creating a bridge between the mystical and the measurable. In his laboratories, filled with vessels, retorts, and furnaces, Jabir and those who followed him explored the properties of acids, discovering methods to dissolve substances that at once seemed immutable. He described crystallization, filtration, and distillation, not as vague mysteries, but as repeatable techniques, advancing the craft from sacred art toward systematic science. The very word alchemy itself, shaped by the Arabic alchemia, reflects this inheritance, a reminder that it was in the Islamic world that the discipline took on its most organized and enduring form. Yet even as he pursued the practical, Jabir did not abandon the spiritual dimensions of the art. For him, matter and spirit remained intertwined, and he believed that the refinement of substances mirrored the refinement of the soul. His works combined detailed instructions with philosophical reflection, blending calculation with meditation, so that every experiment carried both scientific and symbolic weight. He did not see contradiction in this unity. Instead, he saw harmony, the belief that the universe operated by laws both material and divine, and that to uncover one was to draw closer to the other. Through Jabir's vision and the countless treatises attributed to his name, alchemy became not just the guarded secret of isolated adepts, but a vast body of knowledge, copied, translated, and studied by scholars across the Islamic world. His influence spread into Europe through the translation of Arabic texts into Latin, and long after his death, his name continued to be invoked as the authority upon which alchemists and chemists alike built their understanding. Thus, in the crucible of the Islamic Golden Age, alchemy shed much of its obscurity and entered a new stage, one where symbols still spoke to the soul, but where experiments spoke equally to the intellect. And in this synthesis of faith and reason, imagination and observation, it laid the foundation upon which the modern sciences of chemistry and medicine would eventually rise. The knowledge that had been refined in the laboratories of the Islamic world did not remain confined to Baghdad, Cairo, or Cordoba, for in time it crossed the shifting borders of culture and language, carried by scholars, merchants, and translators who recognized its value. In the bustling cities of medieval Spain and Sicily, where the Islamic and Christian worlds touched, libraries held manuscripts filled with Arabic writings on philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and alchemy. It was here, in places like Toledo and Palermo, that tireless translators labored by candlelight, turning these texts into Latin so that European scholars, long starved of such knowledge, could finally drink from the same well of wisdom. What had once been whispered in the firelit halls of Persian sages, or inscribed carefully by the hand of Jabir, now began to circulate in monasteries, universities, and the courts of kings, sparking a new era of fascination with the mysteries of transformation. Yet in Europe, alchemy did not unfold in the same way it had in Egypt or Persia. Here, it encountered a culture deeply shaped by Christianity, a faith that dominated both spiritual and intellectual life, The scholars who studied the translated texts did not see alchemy merely as a science of substances, but as a sacred pursuit that could be woven into the fabric of their own religious beliefs. For in their hands, alchemy became a bridge between experiment and theology. Its symbols interpreted not only as metaphors for matter, but also as parables for the soul as journey toward salvation. To a medieval European alchemist, the furnace was more than a vessel of heat. It was an image of purgatory, the place where impurities were burned away. The base metals were likened to sinful humanity, flawed and unworthy, while the purified gold represented the perfected soul, radiant and incorruptible in the presence of God. Distillation, purification, and transmutation became more than chemical processes. They were spiritual exercises, signs of God's work mirrored in the physical world. Even the philosopher's stone, that elusive substance believed capable of turning lead into gold, was often reimagined as a symbol of Christ himself, the divine element that could transform the mortal into the eternal. Monks and mystics cloaked their experiments in language drawn from Scripture, filling their treatises with references to angels, sacraments, and the mysteries of creation. Their laboratories were often little more than extensions of the cloister, where prayer accompanied experiment and where the pursuit of knowledge was framed as a devotion rather than ambition. Alchemy in Europe became a curious blend of faith and practice, its recipes hidden beneath allegory, its meaning obscured in coded language, so that only the worthy might grasp the truth. Thus, when alchemy took root in medieval Europe, it was transformed as much as the metals it sought to refine. It became both a science and a theology, a hidden art whispered about in monasteries, practiced in secret chambers, and guarded in books filled with symbols and metaphors. What began in the fires of Egypt and Persia now flickered within the heart of Christendom, reshaped by its mystical vision and bound to a spiritual purpose, preparing the stage for centuries of seekers who would search not only for gold, but for God's hidden order within the very fabric of matter. As alchemy wove itself into the fabric of medieval Europe, shaped by the translations of Arabic wisdom and the meditations of Christian mystics, it soon became dominated by one overwhelming vision, quest so powerful that it drew the devotion of countless seekers for centuries, the search for the philosopher's stone. To those who labored in hidden chambers, poring over manuscripts filled with strange symbols and diagrams, this mysterious substance was believed to hold the power not only to transmute base metals into pure, incorruptible gold, but also to reveal the deeper perfection of creation itself. The stone was more than a material object. It was a promise, a symbol, a riddle whispered by the universe. And in its pursuit, alchemy reached both its highest dreams and its deepest obsessions. The idea of transforming dull, heavy lead into shining gold captivated the imagination of kings and peasants alike. For gold was not only wealth but permanence, a substance that seemed untouched by time, immune to rust, decay, or corruption. To create it from the most common of metals was to defy the natural order, to prove mastery over matter itself, and to hold in one's hands the key to endless prosperity. Monarchs sponsored alchemists in the hope of filling their treasuries with limitless riches, while wandering adepts sought patrons with promises that the secret lay just within reach, hidden only by cryptic language and complex symbols waiting to be deciphered. For some, the stone represented power over the material world, a chance to bend nature to human will. Yet for others, the philosopher's stone was never about wealth at all. Within the allegories of Christian alchemy, the stone took on a far more profound meaning. It became the emblem of spiritual transformation, the perfection of the soul mirrored in the perfection of gold. Just as impure metals could be cleansed of their flaws, so too could the human heart, burdened by sin and weakness, be purified until it shone with the light of the divine. To many alchemists, the stone was Christ himself, the cornerstone rejected yet essential. It's a hidden presence capable of transforming not only matter, of the very essence of humanity. In this way, the pursuit of the stone was not a greedy chase for riches, but a pilgrimage of the spirit, a journey toward salvation disguised in the language of furnaces and retorts. The literature of the time reflected this dual vision, filled with strange images of dragons devouring themselves, kings and queens uniting in mystical marriage, metals speaking with human voices, and stones glowing within a fire. To the uninitiated, these writings seemed like nonsense, riddles deliberately designed to confuse. But to the dedicated alchemist, each image was a step along the path, a symbol that pointed toward the great secret. The work was dangerous, often fruitless, and endlessly demanding, yet hope never faded, because the stone represented not just an object, but a horizon, a vision of ultimate mastery, ultimate knowledge, ultimate perfection. Thus, the philosopher's stone became the heart of alchemy, a flame that drew countless seekers toward its light, even as it often consumed them in the process. Whether imagined as a physical substance locked away in the deepest mystery of nature, or as the spiritual treasure hidden within the soul, it remained the ultimate prize, binding together the mystical and the material, the earthly and the divine in one dazzling and elusive dream. The more the vision of the philosopher's stone captured imaginations, the more suspicion began to gather around those who pursued it, for in medieval Europe, the church stood watchful over every form of knowledge and anything that seemed to border on forbidden. Power was met with unease, if not outright condemnation. Alchemists spoke of transformations, of hidden forces within nature, of secrets written into the fabric of the world. And though many framed their work in the language of Christian devotion, authorities often feared that such claims strayed too close to heresy, that the pursuit of turning lead into gold was less a path to salvation and more a temptation toward greed and pride. And so, slowly but inevitably, alchemy was pushed into the shadows, no longer practiced openly in monasteries or courts, but hidden in chambers, guarded by codes, and whispered among circles of the initiated. Secrecy became the alchemist's shield. Manuscripts that once might have explained experiments directly were instead cloaked in allegories and symbols, written in languages that seemed designed to confuse outsiders. Diagrams of suns, moons, serpents biting their own tails, kings in union with queens, and strange vessels bubbling with life filled the pages, each symbol layered with meaning only the trained eye could decipher. Recipes were written not in plain measurements, but in riddles, describing substances in metaphors, the green lion devouring the sun, the black crow signaling decay, the philosophical egg holding the secret of creation. These images were not merely poetic decoration, they were a code, a way to protect sacred knowledge from prying eyes while still allowing it to be preserved for those deemed worthy to inherit it. Secret societies and brotherhoods began to emerge, groups bound by oaths of silence and loyalty, where teachings were passed not in public lecture, but in whispered instruction and ritual. To enter such a circle was to step into a world where truth was guarded like treasure, where every word and gesture might conceal a deeper significance. Alchemists learned to recognize one another not by open declaration, but by subtle signs, a shared symbol carved into a doorway, a phrase woven into casual speech, a drawing that carried hidden meaning. In this underground world, alchemy became less a discipline for all and more an initiation, a path reserved for the few who were willing to endure both its hardships and its secrecy. The act of concealment gave the art an aura of mystery that both attracted and repelled. To some, the secrecy made alchemists appear like sorcerers meddling with forces beyond human right, a perception that sometimes placed them in danger of persecution. To others, the hidden nature of the work only increased its allure, suggesting that within those cryptic texts and veiled experiments lay truths too powerful to be spoken aloud. Thus, alchemy survived, not through open institutions, but through the resilience of manuscripts passed hand to hand through symbols carved into its margins, through societies that endured in the shadows, preserving the dream of transformation even when the world above condemned it. In this way, alchemy lived on like an underground stream, invisible on the surface, yet flowing steadily beneath, waiting for the time when it would resurface once more, reshaped but not extinguished. Its fire still glowing in hidden furnaces and in the guarded hearts of those who believed that matter and spirit alike held within them the promise of perfection. For centuries, alchemy had hidden in shadows, preserved through symbols, allegories, and the secret societies that guarded its mysteries. But as Europe entered the age of reason and the sweeping changes of the Enlightenment, the world began to demand clarity, proof, structure, where once mystery had been enough. The intellectual climate shifted, and with it, the practice of alchemy itself. For while the dream of transmutation lingered, the methods of inquiry were no longer satisfied with riddles or allegories. Scholars now insisted on experiments that could be repeated, on explanations that could be tested, on knowledge that could be shared openly rather than concealed behind coded texts. It was in this crucible of change that alchemy gradually shed its mystical garments and took on the more disciplined identity of modern chemistry. Guided by figures who transformed curiosity into science. Among the earliest to shape this transition was Robert Boyle, an English thinker often called the father of modern chemistry. Boyle did not entirely reject alchemy. He had studied its writings, experimented with its recipes, and understood the centuries of tradition it carried. Yet, he demanded that investigation of the natural world be grounded in method and observation rather than allegory. In his landmark work, The Skeptical Chemist, Boyle challenged the old belief that all matter was formed from the classical elements of earth, air, fire, and water, proposing instead that substances were composed of smaller particles, ideas that anticipated the atomic theory to come. Where alchemists had once cloaked their work in metaphor, Boyle insisted on clarity, on describing experiments step by step so that others might confirm or refute them. His approach marked a decisive shift, turning the hidden art into a field that could be studied, debated, and advanced collectively. Yet, it was in the following century that Antoine Lavoisier, the French chemist later hailed as the father of modern chemistry, completed the transformation. Lavoisier brought a precision to the study of substances that no alchemist had ever attempted. Introducing careful measurement, the balance scale, and the rigorous naming of elements, he demonstrated that matter was neither created nor destroyed in chemical reactions, but merely changed form, laying the foundation for the law of conservation of mass. With this insight, the old dream of the philosopher's stone, the hope of conjuring gold from lead, began to fade, replaced by the realization that nature followed laws that could be understood, laws that left no room for the magical shortcuts alchemists had so long pursued. The Enlightenment did not destroy alchemy so much as transform it, preserving its spirit of curiosity and its passion for transformation, while discarding its secrecy and mysticism. What survived was the discipline of chemistry, a science capable of unlocking the hidden properties of matter, of developing medicines, fuels, and technologies that would reshape the modern world. And yet, even as Boyle and Lavoisier gave the field a new identity, the echoes of alchemy remained, for the fascination with the transformation, whether of matter or of spirit, continued to inspire a reminder that science itself had once been born from the marriage of fire, faith, and dreams. Although the Enlightenment has stripped alchemy of its secrecy and transfigured it into the clear and ordered science of chemistry, the old art did not vanish from human imagination, for its language of symbols, its dream of transformation, and its profound metaphors for the human journey proved too powerful to be extinguished by scales and formulas alone. While laboratories and universities turned their attention to measurable reactions and the cataloging of elements, alchemy quietly survived in another form, woven into the fabric of psychology, spirituality, in the symbolic imagination of cultures across the world. What had once been dismissed as superstition began to reveal itself as a treasury of metaphors for the inner life, a mirror through which people could still glimpse the mysteries of change, growth, and the search for wholeness. In the 20th century, perhaps no one revived the spiritual and psychological dimensions of alchemy more vividly than Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst who believed that the cryptic texts and images of the alchemists were not merely misguided attempts at chemistry, but profound expressions of the human unconscious. Jung studied manuscripts filled with dragons, kings, queens, suns, and moons, and he recognized in them the same patterns he had seen in the dreams and visions of his patients. To him, alchemical transformation was nothing less than a symbolic language of the psyche, the process by which the fragmented self undergoes trials, purifications, and symbolic deaths in order to be reborn into greater wholeness. The philosopher's stone, in Jung's view, was not a mineral, but the symbol of the completed self, the union of opposites, the reconciliation of shadow and light within the human soul. This interpretation breathed new life into alchemy, restoring its relevance in a world that had long since abandoned the hope of transmuting lead into gold. Through Jung and his followers, alchemy became a vocabulary for spiritual growth, a map for understanding the painful yet necessary transformations of life, and a way of describing the mysterious journey of becoming. The symbols of fire and water, death and rebirth, dissolution and coagulation were no longer recipes for laboratory work, but metaphors for the struggles and victories of the human heart. Beyond psychology, alchemy continued to inspire artists, writers, and seekers of spiritual wisdom. Painters found in its imagery a rich tapestry of archetypes. Poets drew upon its language of transformation to capture the essence of creativity. Mystics saw in its patterns a universal story that transcended culture and religion. The alchemical motto, solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine, became not only a formula for metals, but a guiding principle for life, suggesting that in destruction lies renewal, and in the breaking apart of the old lies the possibility of something greater emerging. Thus, even though the furnaces of the alchemists grew cold, and their experiments gave way to the systematic laws of chemistry, the essence of their work endured. Alchemy lived on as a philosophy of the spirit, a psychology of the unconscious, and a reservoir of symbols that continue to speak to the human longing for transformation. In this way, its legacy proved to be indestructible, for it was never only about metals or stones, but about the eternal dream that everything, matter, mind, and soul, could be purified, transfigured, and perfected. While many in the modern age looked back on alchemy as a failed science or a curious relic of human history, Carl Jung perceived something far deeper, something that transcended the laboratory and reached into the hidden chambers of the mind. He believed that the strange visions recorded by the alchemists, with their images of serpents consuming themselves, kings and queens uniting in sacred marriage, or metals dissolving and reforming in glass vessels, were not the errors of confused experimenters, but the symbolic language of the unconscious, a coded record of humanity's timeless journey toward inner transformation. To Jung, alchemy was a mirror in which the human psyche revealed itself long before the language of psychology had even been invented. He devoted years to studying obscure manuscripts, poring over pages crowded with symbols, diagrams, and metaphors that seemed nonsensical to those trained only in the scientific tradition. But where others saw riddles, Jung saw patterns, and these patterns resonated with the dreams and fantasies of his patients. He noticed that the same archetypes which appeared in alchemical texts, the shadowy figure of the black crow, the purifying fire, the rebirth of the radiant child, appeared also in the symbolic landscapes of the human mind, rising from the depths of the unconscious as individuals struggled with the pain of loss, the trials of growth, and the search for meaning. Alchemy, in this sense, became for Jung a symbolic roadmap, a guide to understanding the stages of psychological development. The central process of alchemy, the great work known as the magnum opus, with its cycles of dissolution, purification, and rebirth, became for Jung the perfect metaphor for individuation. It's the lifelong journey by which a person integrates the hidden parts of themselves into a greater whole. Just as metals were believed to pass through blackness, whitening, and eventual perfection in gold, so too did the soul pass through stages of confrontation with darkness, reconciliation with opposites, and finally the birth of a more complete self. The philosopher's stone, once imagined as a physical object capable of producing endless wealth, was in Jung's eyes the symbol of psychic wholeness, the treasure that emerged when a person faced their inner conflicts and reconciled the many fragments of their being into harmony. What fascinated Jung most was that alchemy, long before the advent of modern psychology, had already provided images for experiences of inner transformation that countless individuals endured. It was as if the alchemists working in their smoky laboratories centuries ago were unknowingly projecting their inner struggles onto their furnaces and vessels, writing in the language of metals and elements the same psychological truths that still guide humanity today. In this way, Jung argued, alchemy was not a failed science at all, but an unconscious psychology, a symbolic attempt to chart the deepest processes of the human mind. Through his reinterpretation, alchemy found new life in the modern world. It's no longer confined to forgotten manuscripts or dismissed as superstition. It became a profound tool for understanding the self, offering a vision of transformation that reached beyond matter into the very core of human existence, reminding us that the greatest gold we can ever create is the light we uncover within ourselves. From the hidden landscapes of the human psyche, the story of transformation takes an unexpected turn, leading us away from the symbolic laboratories of the alchemists and into the very earth itself, where stone rather than metal held the key to survival. In the rugged heart of central Turkey lies Cappadocia, a land marked by soft volcanic rock shaped into otherworldly spires and valleys, a place that, for centuries, seemed only to hold legends whispered among travelers. Yet, in the 20th century, when archaeologists began to peel back the layers of dust and time, they discovered something astonishing. Beneath the rolling hills and honeycombed cliffs lay vast underground cities, immense labyrinths carved into the rock-hidden worlds where thousands of people once lived, worked, and sought refuge from the dangers above. These subterranean metropolises were not small hideouts, but sprawling complexes descending multiple levels into the earth, complete with stables, kitchens, storage chambers, wine presses, wells, schools, chapels, and intricate ventilation shafts that carried fresh air down to the deepest passages. Some estimates suggest that the largest of them, such as Daring Q, could shelter more than 20,000 people at a time, their lives unfolding entirely beneath the surface. Narrow tunnels connected levels like veins in a body, while great circular stone doors weighing hundreds of pounds could be rolled across passageways to seal the inhabitants from invaders. Within these depths, families cooked meals, artisans plied their trades, and children played by the flickering light of torches, all while the world above carried on, unaware that beneath its soil, entire civilizations were hidden in shadow. The existence of such cities raises questions as compelling as any alchemical riddle. Who first conceived of them? How did generations of builders carve such vast spaces with primitive tools, patiently hollowing out chambers in the soft rock, linking them together in a network so sophisticated that it rivaled the engineering feats of the surface world? Historians suggest that early Christians used these sanctuaries to escape waves of persecution, while others believe that they were defensive havens against invading armies long before Christianity spread through the region. Whatever their origin, these cities reveal a vision of survival rooted not in transformation of metals or the self, but in transformation of the very landscape, bending nature to human necessity in one of the most dramatic ways imaginable. The rediscovery of Cappadocia's underground world in the 20th century ignited fascination across the globe. for it was as though the earth itself had been keeping a secret, guarding the memory of entire communities who lived and thrived beneath its surface. Standing in the silent tunnels today, one can almost hear the echoes of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the clang of tools against stone, the prayers whispered in dim chapels carved from the bedrock. These hidden worlds remind us that transformation is not only a matter of spirit or science, but also of survival. The human beings, when pressed by necessity, will carve out new lives in even the most unlikely places, turning darkness into shelter and silence into sanctuary. The most extraordinary of these subterranean marvels is Durinkyu, a city that plunges more than 200 feet below the earth, its passageways spiraling downward through layer after layer of carefully carved stone. To step inside is to enter a world that seems at once alien and profoundly human, a place where necessity and ingenuity fuse to create a hidden metropolis. Unlike a simple cave or shelter, Durinkyu was designed with astonishing complexity, its many levels organized like a city turned upside down, descending instead of rising, expanding inward rather than outward, yet containing every feature one would expect of a community on the surface. Within its depths, families carved out living quarters, modest chambers where entire households could sleep, eat, and carry on the daily rhythms of life. Chapels were hollowed out to provide spaces of worship, their arches and altars emerging directly from the volcanic rock. Proof that even in concealment, faith was a central pillar of existence. Stables were created to house animals, ensuring that livestock could be kept safe during times of siege. Their airways carefully designed so that the breath of beasts did not suffocate the people living alongside them. Storage rooms, wine presses, and kitchens allow food to be preserved and prepared, sustaining thousands for weeks or months when retreat into the earth was the only hope of survival. But perhaps most remarkable of all were the defensive systems embedded into the very bones of the city. Narrow corridors forced intruders to enter in single file, their progress slowed and vulnerable. Gigantic circular stone doors, some as wide as 6 feet and weighing hundreds of pounds, were carved to roll into place across key passageways, sealing off entire sections of the city. Once shut, these barriers could only be moved from within, rendering the underground stronghold nearly impenetrable. Ventilation shafts, disguised on the surface as ordinary wells, carried fresh air into the lowest levels, while underground waterways provided clean drinking water that enemies on the surface could not poison. Every detail reveals a design born of caution and experience, the accumulated wisdom of generations who knew the necessity of protection and the ingenuity required to achieve it. Walking through these tunnels today, one can sense the duality of their purpose. They were at once a refuge of safety and a place of endurance, both a home and a fortress. In times of peace, their chambers might have lain empty or served as storage, silent but ever ready. Yet, when threats descended, whether invading armies sweeping across Anatolia or waves of persecution driving people from the light of day, these stone corridors filled with life, echoing with voices, footsteps, and the steady determination of a community that refused to be broken. Durinkyu and the other cities of Cappadocia stand as testaments to human resilience, places where survival demanded creativity of the highest order, where people transformed a hostile landscape into a sanctuary capable of sheltering thousands. They remind us that civilization is not only built in grand palaces and open fields, but sometimes in the hidden depths, carved patiently into the earth by those who understood that survival was itself a form of transformation, the turning of fear into strength, of darkness into refuge, of stone into sanctuary. What makes the underground cities of Cappadocia even more astonishing is not only the sheer scale of their construction, but the ingenuity with which they were designed to sustain entire populations hidden from the surface world. These were not temporary shelters carved hastily in moments of panic. They were sophisticated strongholds, vast enough to house thousands of men, women, and children, along with their animals, food supplies, and the sacred spaces they required for worship. Every passage and chamber reflected a careful consideration of survival, as if generations of builders had poured their knowledge into the stone, creating environments where life could continue uninterrupted even in the face of siege or disaster. Ventilation shafts, rising like hidden lungs through the rock, supplied the deep levels with fresh air, allowing those below to breathe comfortably while remaining invisible to those above. Some of these shafts were so cleverly disguised on the surface that enemies could walk across them without ever realizing they were walking above an entire city. Wells were carved into the depths to provide clean water, and these too were protected, with some designed to be cut off from the surface in case of invasion, ensuring that life underground could be sustained for months without reliance on the outside world. The ingenuity extended beyond mere survival into defense. Rolling stone doors, circular and massive, stood ready to seal off entire corridors with a single push. These great slabs, often weighing more than a ton, were balanced so perfectly that one or two people could set them in place from within, locking the passageways against intruders. Once rolled into position, they were nearly impossible to move from the outside, turning narrow tunnels into deadly traps for any who dared to invade. Combined with twisting passageways that forced enemies to enter in single file, these defenses made the underground cities nearly impregnable, fortresses that could withstand the most determined of assaults. Within this fortified labyrinth, life carried on with remarkable normalcy. Families gathered in living quarters, children played in side chambers, animals were kept in stables, and chapels echoed with prayer. The knowledge that above them armies might rage or dangers might roam only reinforced the importance of the sanctuary they had created below. In these depths, stone was transformed from an unforgiving element into protection. Air was channeled through invisible veins, and the necessities of life were secured with ingenuity that rivals any achievement on the surface. To stand in such a place today is to feel the hum of resilience in the walls. To sense the determination of people who refuse to surrender to fear. The underground cities of Cappadocia remind us that survival is not merely a matter of hiding, but of adapting, turning the very earth into a shield, of mastering both nature and necessity. They are monuments not only to engineering, but to human courage, a testament that even when pressed into the deepest darkness, communities could carve out safety, light, and life where none should have been possible. Even with all we know about their size and their astonishing design, one of the greatest enigmas of Cappadocia's underground cities remains their origin. The tunnels and chambers still whisper of ancient hands that carved them. Yet, the identity of those first builders remained shrouded in mystery, debated fiercely among historians and archaeologists. Some claim that the earliest foundations may stretch as far back as the Hittites, that Bronze Age empire which once ruled Anatolia over 3,000 years ago. Those people were known for their monumental fortresses and mastery of stonework. Others point to the Phrygians, who flourished centuries later, suggesting that they too may have begun hollowing out the rock, carving the earliest sanctuaries in times of war. Still others believe the Byzantines were the true architects, expanding these labyrinths into cities during waves of invasion, their Christian faith compelling them to retreat into the depths to preserve their lives and their worship. And there are even those who speculate the roots may reach back further still. Two cultures so ancient that their names have been lost to time. The volcanic rock of Cappadocia, soft yet durable, once exposed to air, lent itself naturally to excavation, and generation after generation may have contributed to the expanding network. Perhaps what began as a handful of small shelters grew over centuries into immense underground metropolises, each new era leaving its mark upon the stone. A Hittite chamber may have become a Phrygian hall, later widened by Byzantine hands into a chapel, all of it layered like the rings of a tree, a record of civilizations hidden not in ink but in rock itself. To walk the tunnels today is to walk through history, compressed into stone, the identity of its builders blurred into a tapestry of cultures, each one responding to the same timeless need for safety and survival. The Byzantine theory carries special weight, for Cappadocia became a refuge for early Christians fleeing persecution, and later a frontier land threatened by Arab raids and shifting empires. In such times, the underground cities would have offered not only protection, but the chance to preserve faith, culture, and community against forces that sought to extinguish them. Chapels carved with crosses, frescoes painted on rock walls, and altars hewn into stone seem to testify to this use. Yet, none of these features prove beyond doubt that the Byzantines were the original builders. They may simply have inherited and expanded what earlier peoples had begun, weaving their own story into a much older fabric. The lack of definitive answers only deepens the allure. Was Daring Q first imagined by Hittite engineers desperate to survive waves of invasion in the late Bronze Age? Did the Phrygians, who carved entire cities into rock above ground, also extend their architecture below? Or did the Byzantines, facing constant pressure along their borders, perfect the underground fortresses into the marvels we know today? The stones remain silent, holding their secrets close, but their silence only amplifies the mystery, inviting each visitor to imagine the countless generations who once walked those hidden halls. And so the underground cities of Cappadocia stand as riddles carved into the earth, their origins obscured, their story unfinished. Reminders that history is never fully written, that beneath every answer lies another question waiting in the dark. If the mystery of who first carved Cappadocia's underground labyrinths remains unsolved, the question of why they were built is just as compelling, and perhaps even more fascinating, for the theories stretch across the spectrum of human fear and imagination. Most historians agree that their design strongly suggests defense, a strategy born from centuries of living in a land where empires rose and fell in endless succession. Anatolia was a crossroads of conquest, a land where armies clashed, borders shifted, and invasions were as constant as the changing of seasons. In such a landscape, retreating underground offered a decisive advantage, a chance to vanish from sight, while rolling stone doors and twisting tunnels rendered the hidden cities into fortresses. Families could vanish beneath the earth as raiders swept across the valleys above, only to re-emerge when danger had passed, alive because they had become shadows in the stone. Others suggest that beyond invaders, natural disasters may have driven people underground. Cappadocia's volcanic terrain is a land shaped by fire, its spires and cliffs carved by eruptions and erosion over millennia. Earthquakes were not strangers to this region, and the idea of finding refuge within the stable depths of rock may have appealed to ancient builders who sought security not only from human enemies, but from the wrath of nature itself. The cities, with their reinforced chambers and air shafts, could serve as sanctuaries in times when the surface seemed uncertain, when storms raged or tremors shook the land. In this interpretation, the underground world was not merely a fortress, but a haven of stability, a place where human life could persist no matter what chaos unfolded above. Yet there are also those who whisper of stranger possibilities, theories that cross the boundary from history into myth. Some claim the sheer scale of the underground cities, far larger than what might be expected for short-term hiding places, suggest they were designed for long-term habitation. Keys, as though their builders anticipated threats far more enduring than a passing army. This has given rise to speculation that they were not merely refuges, but entire civilizations prepared to live for months, even years, below the earth. Legends speak of mythological dangers, of demons, giants, or even otherworldly forces against which the people sought to shield themselves, cank their safety into stone because no place on the surface could protect them. Such theories may never be proven, yet they testify to the human imagination, the sense that something so vast and carefully designed must have been born from more than ordinary fear. But ever the truth. The underground cities of Cappadocia remind us that the line between history and legend is often blurred. The necessity and imagination are twin architects in the story of civilization. Whether they were built to repel invaders, to withstand the fury of nature, or to hide from threats half remembered in myth, they remain monuments to survival, standing silent beneath the soil, yet alive with the echo of human determination. An eternal reminder that when pressed to the limits, people will carve new worlds wherever they must, even deep in the darkness below. If these hidden cities were born out of necessity, what truly captivates the imagination is not only their construction, but the way of life that unfolded within their walls, for they were not merely places to hide, but complete societies recreated beneath the surface of the earth. To walk through the tunnels today is to step into the ghost of a community that once thrived in shadow, where every aspect of daily existence had been carefully considered and built into the rock. Far from being cold, empty caverns, these were living worlds where families gathered, where children learned, where animals were kept safe, and where the faithful raised their voices in prayer despite the weight of stone above them. Communal kitchens lay at the heart of these subterranean communities, their walls blackened by centuries of smoke from hearths where food was prepared for hundreds at once. Massive stone troughs and grinding areas suggest that grains were brought below and milled into flour, which could then be baked into bread to feed entire families. Storage rooms preserved wine and oil, their jars sealed to last long months underground. The scent of cooking must have mingled with the earthy smell of the stone itself, reminding all who lived there that even in the depths of the earth, life went on with its familiar comforts. Children did not grow up in silence either, for evidence suggests that education continued within these hidden halls. Schools, carved with benches and niches, offered places where knowledge could be passed down, where the young learned not only their letters and prayers, but the skills they would need to keep the community alive. One can almost imagine the echoes of young voices reciting lessons, the flicker of torchlight dancing across their eager faces as teachers tried to preserve culture and continuity, even in times of fear. Livestock, too, had their place in the underground cities. Pens were hollowed out to keep goats, sheep, and even larger animals, ensuring that milk, wool, and meat were available even when the people above could not risk emerging. Ingenious air shafts allowed the breath of animals to escape without poisoning the air for their human companions. Proof of a sophisticated understanding of how to sustain life in confined spaces. The presence of animals would have brought both challenges and comfort, their sounds and warmth weaving into the fabric of underground existence. It's a reminder that survival required the cooperation of every living being, and always faith found its place, for no community could endure without the solace of worship. Chapels, carved from the rock, some adorned with simple frescoes, became sanctuaries where families gathered to pray, their voices rising softly in hymns that echoed through the stone corridors. Here, surrounded by darkness, light was found in devotion, and the endurance of the spirit matched the endurance of the body. Daily life underground was not easy, but it was life nonetheless, a rhythm of cooking, learning, tending animals, and praying, carried out in a world of stone. These hidden cities were not only fortresses of survival, but homes of resilience. Proof that even in the deepest dark, humanity will create community, culture, and hope. As if the sheer scale of a single underground city were not enough to inspire wonder, archaeologists eventually uncovered evidence that these vast subterranean worlds were not isolated creations, but part of an even more astonishing network. Some of the cities were linked by tunnels that stretched 4 kilometers beneath the earth, narrow passageways winding silently through the stone, weaving one hidden community into another. Imagine walking through such a tunnel centuries ago, the dim glow, the torch illuminating only a few steps ahead, the sound of footsteps echoing into the unseen distance, knowing that at the end of that long and winding path lay another city, another sanctuary carved into the rock, another community waiting in the shadows. These tunnels were more than simple corridors. They were arteries of survival, allowing people to move between settlements in times of danger without ever exposing themselves to the surface. When armies swept across the valleys, when raiders threatened the villages above, entire populations could vanish into the stone and, if necessary, relocate unseen to neighboring cities, carrying their lives with them through these hidden veins of earth. In this way, Cappadocia's underground civilization was not merely a collection of isolated strongholds, but a connected whole, a hidden kingdom spread beneath the soil, capable of protecting tens of thousands of people across a sprawling landscape. The engineering required for such an achievement is staggering. Carving a single chamber or hallway was already a feat of patience and labor, yet to extend tunnels for kilometers, ensuring they remained structurally sound, navigable, and supplied with air reveals a mastery of subterranean design far beyond what one might expect from ancient hands. The builders created air shafts to prevent suffocation, widened sections of tunnel to serve as gathering points or storage stops, and, in some cases, installed defensive features even within the connecting passages. Should intruders somehow discover these hidden arteries, they, too, could be sealed with stone doors or collapse to protect those deeper within the network. To walk these tunnels today is to feel the strange sensation of standing inside a hidden web of history, as though beneath the ordinary surface world there existed an entire parallel civilization, invisible yet enduring. Above ground, villagers farmed, worshipped, and traded in the light of day. Below, an entire infrastructure lay waiting, ready to be filled with life the moment danger returned. The people of Cappadocia lived in two worlds at once, and the tunnels were the lifelines that bound them together. It is difficult not to marvel at the vision that such interconnected cities reveal. These were not desperate improvisations, but carefully planned systems, but built and expanded over generations by people who understood that survival was not a matter of chance, but of preparation. The tunnels made the underground cities more than fortresses. They made them a civilization in their own right, a hidden nation carved from stone, linked not by walls or roads, but by darkness and endurance, by the silent promise that even in the harshest times, life would find a way to endure. For all that has been uncovered beneath Cappadocia's windswept valleys and towering rock formations, the story of its underground world is far from complete, for modern discoveries suggest that what has already been revealed may only be a fraction of the whole. Even in recent decades, archaeologists and villagers alike have stumbled upon new passageways and chambers hidden beneath houses, fields, and ancient ruins, hinting at vast expanses of subterranean architecture that remain buried and unexplored. The soil still conceals secrets, and every discovery deepens the sense that Cappadocia's underground civilization was greater and more sophisticated than anyone had dared to imagine. One of the most remarkable findings came in the early 21st century, when construction workers digging in Nivihir uncovered the entrance to what is believed to be one of the largest underground complexes ever discovered in the region, a labyrinth stretching across dozens of acres, far larger even than Daring Q. Initial explorations revealed miles of interconnected corridors, storage halls, chapels, and living quarters, suggesting that entire populations once sheltered within its depths. Some archaeologists speculate that it could rival or even surpass all previously known underground cities in size, a hidden metropolis that had lain undisturbed for centuries beneath the feet of modern villagers. The discovery reignited global fascination with Cappadocia, for if such a place could remain concealed until now, what else might still lie waiting in the silent rock? The thought that countless other complexes remain hidden adds a tantalizing layer to the mystery. Cappadocia's soft volcanic tuff makes excavation relatively easy, which means that generations of builders could have carved far more than what is currently known. The region may still hold tunnels that run for kilometers, yet unseen, chambers vast enough to house thousands, or sanctuaries filled with frescoes, altars, and artifacts that tell stories lost to recorded history. It is as though the land itself has become a book written in stone, with entire chapters still sealed, awaiting the patient work of time, chance, and exploration to reveal them. For archaeologists, these discoveries pose as many challenges as they do opportunities. Excavating underground cities requires careful balance, for the same soft stone that allows them to be carved also makes them fragile, vulnerable to collapse if disturbed without care. Many passages remain sealed, not because they are empty, but because to open them prematurely might destroy what they have preserved for centuries. And so Cappadocia continues to guard its secrets, offering only glimpses of the vast hidden world that lies beneath its surface. The realization that there are still larger and more complex underground networks yet to be explored transforms our understanding of these ancient people. What drove them to create such immense subterranean realms? How did they coordinate such colossal efforts without modern tools or technologies? The answers remain buried, waiting in darkness. For now, what lies beneath Cappadocia is both a treasure of history and a reminder that the earth is still full of mysteries, that entire worlds can lie hidden beneath our feet, waiting for the day when their silence is finally broken. Across the sweep of history, from the smoke-filled forges of medieval blacksmiths to the hidden laboratories of alchemists, and finally to the vast underground worlds carved beneath the earth in Cappadocia, a single thread emerges, binding these seemingly distant stories into one tapestry. The unyielding resilience of human beings in the face of hardship and uncertainty. Each tale is a reflection of the same enduring truth that when confronted with danger, darkness, or despair, humanity does not surrender, but instead transforms its circumstances, shaping survival out of struggle, finding meaning in mystery, and carving hope from stone and flame. The blacksmith, hunched over his anvil, endured a life of relentless labor, his body scarred by burns, and his lungs choked with smoke. Yet, through his suffering, he forged the very tools that sustained his village. His hammer strikes were not only acts of survival, but of creation, turning raw, unyielding metal into the means by which others farmed, fought, and built their lives. He was the embodiment of endurance, transforming pain into usefulness, his hidden strength echoing through every plow, every weapon, every hinge he created. The alchemist, working in secrecy with furnaces and vessels, sought truths beyond the surface of matter. Whether in the temples of Egypt, the fire worship of Persia, the mysticism of Europe, or the systematic science of the Islamic Golden Age. He pursued transformation not merely of metal, but of the soul. To him, the purification of gold was a mirror of the purification of humanity, and the elusive philosopher as stone became not just a promise of wealth, but a symbol of perfection, of the possibility that all things, even flawed, imperfect, suffering beings, might be remade into something luminous and whole. Though modern science replaced his methods, his vision endured, and his symbols became the language of inner transformation, carried forward into psychology, art, and spirituality. And beneath the valleys of Cappadocia, entire communities retreated into the stone, carving cities that still defy comprehension. These underground worlds were not mere shelters, but thriving civilizations, where kitchens smoked with cooking fires. Schools echoed with children's lessons, chapels resounded with prayer, and hidden tunnels linked one community to another. Here too, humanity proved its resilience, taking the most inhospitable environment imaginable and turning it into a sanctuary where life could continue, even in the face of invasion or catastrophe. They remind us that survival is not only about endurance, but also about ingenuity, about the ability to reshape the very world when the surface becomes unsafe. Taken together, these stories are more than fragments of history, They are reflections of a single, timeless struggle, the quest to endure, to adapt, and to transform. Whether striking iron in the forge, seeking gold in the vessel, or carving safety in the stone, people have always turned hardship into opportunity, always searched for ways to transcend the limits imposed upon them. Mystery, transformation, and resilience are the eternal companions of humanity, guiding us through the darkness, reminding us that even in the harshest conditions, possess the power to create, to endure, and to rise again. From the clang of hammers echoing in medieval forges to the whispered secrets of alchemists in the silent depths of Cappadocia's underground cities, our journey has traced a path through some of the most hidden and extraordinary corners of human history. At first glance, these stories might seem worlds apart. The soot-stained blacksmith bent over his anvil, the alchemist poring over strange symbols in dimly lit chambers, the families who vanished beneath the earth into entire subterranean civilizations. Yet, when woven together, they reveal a single truth that runs through every age: the resilience of humanity, our endless ability to endure, adapt, and transform. Consider the blacksmith. His life was one of hardship, his body scarred by burns, his lungs thick with smoke, his back bent from endless hours of labor, his children pressed into work as apprentices before they even understood freedom, shared in this exhausting cycle. And yet, from that relentless suffering came tools that built villages, weapons that defended kingdoms, and hinges and plows that sustained everyday life. He was rarely thanked, often underpaid, and almost always taken for granted. Still, he endured, striking metal into shapes that outlived him. In the sparks that flew from his hammer, we glimpse both pain and pride. A man who, despite being worn down by his craft, still found moments of satisfaction in a blade perfectly tempered, or a tool flawlessly shaped. Now, turn to the alchemist. Where the blacksmith forged the physical backbone of society, the alchemist pursued mysteries of a different kind. From Egypt's temples, where alchemy was seen as a sacred science, tied to gods and nature, to Persia, where fire was both experiment and prayer, to the Greek-Egyptian philosopher Zosimus, who linked the furnace with the purification of the soul, and to the Islamic Golden Age, where thinkers like Jabir ibn Hayyan transformed alchemy into something systematic, measurable, and repeatable. Alchemy was never just about gold. It was about the dream that imperfection could be perfected, that the base could be elevated, that matter itself mirrored the human soul. Even when the Enlightenment stripped away its mysticism and left behind the clear science of chemistry, through men like Boyle and Lavoisier, its legacy endured in symbol and metaphor. And so it was that centuries later, Carl Jung looked back upon the riddles of alchemists and found in them a hidden psychology, a mirror of the unconscious mind. For him, the philosopher's stone was no longer a mineral, but a metaphor for wholeness. It's a symbol of a self-made, complete after trials and transformations. In this way, alchemy's fire still burns, not in laboratories of smoke and crucibles, but in the depths of our inner lives, where we to dissolve, struggle, and are remade. From the heat of the forge and the mystery of the alchemical vessel, our story descends into the stone chambers of Cappadocia, where entire communities carved their survival into the living rock. Durincue and the other underground cities were feats of engineering and endurance, with stables, kitchens, chapels, and schools buried hundreds of feet below the surface. Great rolling stone doors, sealed passageways, ventilation shafts fed fresh air deep into the earth, and tunnels stretched 4 kilometers, connecting city to city in an unseen network. Thousands lived here, hidden from invaders, sheltered from disaster, their lives continuing in secret beneath the valleys above, and yet their origins remain uncertain. Were they first hollowed out by the Hittites, expanded by the Phrygians, perfected by the Byzantines, or built by some culture even older, long since lost to history? Were they carved to withstand invading armies, to protect against earthquakes and storms, or in response to threats now half remembered in myth? Daily life in these depths Meals prepared in communal kitchens, prayers whispered in chapels, children reciting lessons by torchlight, animals stirring in their pens, speaks of a resilience no less profound than the blacksmith's or the alchemist's. Here too, humanity endured, turning even the darkness of the earth into sanctuary. Together, these stories of iron, fire, and stone form a single reflection of what it means to be human. We labor through pain, yet create beauty and usefulness. We dream of perfection even when it eludes us. We carve refuge from danger in the most unlikely places, whether through the sweat of the forge, the vision of the alchemist, or the hidden strength of those who lived beneath Cappadocia. We are reminded that mystery, transformation, and survival are not exceptions in our story. They are the story itself. And so, as we close this journey through resilience carved into history, let it remind us that the challenges we face, though heavy, are not new. Our ancestors bore their burdens with strength and imagination, and in their sparks, symbols, and stone walls, that we too can transform, endure, and rise. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadows of history and the light of human resilience. May these stories remind you that even in the hardest moments, there is always the possibility of transformation. And now, as the night deepens, let the weight of these tales settle into silence, carrying you gently into rest. Sleep well, dream deeply, and good night.